mentioned, I put in the chat a link to Ivy Main's article. Ivy Main is a former EPA official. She's an attorney, environmental attorney, I suppose. Um, and she is the Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club's main coordinator for renewable energy policy. Um, and she wrote a extremely comprehensive and very good summary of the General Assembly session that was published on the 1st of this month. So I'm going to start my short presentation by quoting her introduction in this article. And then I'm going to focus on bills that Delegate Carlson and Senator Dietz proposed, and the fate of those bills, because it's instructive about how the fate of those bills is instructive of how Governor Youngkin approached environmental legislation this term, and also would I think serve as a basis for community groups to go to those legislators and discuss environmental policy. They both propose, in I think most people's opinions, very helpful legislation on the environmental front, and their bills were either ultimately rejected by the General Assembly, and in the case of Delegate Carlson, the governor's amendments to her legislation were poison pills, and basically served as a starting point for him to pontificate about how the Virginia Clean Economy Act needs to be repealed. So let's So this is, again, reading from the introduction of Ivy Main's article. The session notably failed to produce legislation addressing the widening gap between electricity demand and supply in Virginia. Legislators shied away from measures that would address the growing demand from data centers, but they also couldn't bring themselves to improve the supply picture by supporting landowners who want to host solar facilities. By the time session ended, a mere handful of bills had passed that can improve our ability to meet demand. Still, the initiatives that did pass offered positive steps forward on energy efficiency, distributed generation, interconnection of rooftop solar, energy storage, EV charging, particularly rural charging, and utility planning. In addition, 2 data center related bills passed requiring more planning and transparency during the local permitting process, and tasking utilities with developing demand response programs to relieve some of the added burden on the grid. The 2 data center bills that Ivy Main mentioned were effectively killed, as were most of the energy bills, either by the governor's veto, which was sustained, as I mentioned, or by amendments that made them worse than no action at all. And according to Maine, Governor Youngkin loves data centers, regardless of the consequences to residential ratepayers and communities. He's also stuck in a rut of attacking the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which prioritizes low-cost renewable energy over legacy fossil fuels. And I may specifically mention this, but in another presentation I viewed, I believe it was the League of Conservation Voters presentation, they basically postulated that he is preparing for a 2026 run for Senate against Mark Warner. And so he's laying the groundwork to blame environmental groups and Democratic legislators for rising energy prices due to their adherence to the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So to get on to mention some specifics, I mentioned that uh, Delegate Carlson had sponsored a bill that made a lot of sense. So some people are probably familiar with it, but let me read some of the details. So this was House Bill 1883. So it increased to 3 megawatts from 1 megawatt the size of solar projects that could qualify for renewable energy credits or certificates. It also would give residential ratepayers the right to use power purchase agreements for the first time. That would mandate this to install solar with no money down, and would increase the amount of electricity Dominion would build or buy from solar facilities on previously developed project sites. To give the market a chance to ramp up, Carlson's bill excused Dominion from having to meet its renewable energy certificate obligations from Virginia projects for an additional 2 years, pushing that date from this year to 2027. And the response of the governor was as follows to this bill, which passed with bipartisan support, heavy bipartisan support. Among all these changes, Maine wrote, only changes that the governor liked, or the only change that the governor liked, is the idea of softening the requirements around REC purchases by Dominion. His proposed amendment would make all REC compliance voluntary for 4 years. Effectively, Virginia would have no renewable energy certificate or requirements until 2028, undercutting solar development of any size. His preferred version scraps all the provisions of Carlson's bill, leaving no provisions to support solar development and replacing them. And this is um, a frequent. This makes a frequent appearance in his budget, in his bill amendments, and to some extent his budget amendments too. He replaces the provisions he doesn't like with an open attack on the Virginia Clean Economy Act. Carlson's reaction was, and she sent this to Maine. We sent the administration bipartisan legislation that protects ratepayers, gives Virginians more options for solar on our homes and businesses, and saves rural land. Rather than sign House Bill 1883 into law, the governor used this opportunity to attack the Clean Economy Act from 2020. Instead of looking at the past, our administration should look around. We have a developing energy crisis and are reliant on importing energy to meet our needs. And so the same response, basically, by the governor was made to the two bills that, and they weren't incredibly significant bills, but they did try to establish some sort of study process and transparency around data center development. And the governor basically either vetoed one of the bills and essentially gutted the other one through his amendment process. And so we've got the situation where, according to the JLARC study, which came out before session started, that energy demand is going to essentially double because of data center development. And to some extent, the legislature, but definitely this governor, are not giving Virginia any options to meet that demand or regulate that demand, certainly, but not even meet that demand with solar or other renewable sources. So that's the situation. He also, so I mentioned that Senator Deeds had proposed some legislation too that was helpful, and specifically on the data center front, he had a bill that made it to pretty close to the end of session, but then got basically tabled. And that bill um, was to make the exemption, the sales tax exemption of data center developers contingent upon a commitment to renewable energy to the level of 90%. And some other features that would improve energy efficiency and transparency around the projects. And that exemption was going to be basically held up, I think, by 2028 or 2029. So he gave the data centers in his legislation a few years to propose or to comment or to modify the legislation or to propose programs that would try to meet those standards. And as I said, the legislation didn't pass, but
Sorry.
to make matters worse, the governor is in his budget amendments, and it's Budget Amendment 202, is basically saying that there will be no problems with the exemption through 2050, regardless of the type of energy that's used to power these data centers. So not only is there was no regulation passed this year, but the governor is proposing in his budget amendment to make it a moot point, to make it basically the exemption holding without any restrictions on the type of energy employed through 2050. Okay, and it's going to be up to the legislature whether they are going to accept that amendment. So that is a potential pressure point for our area legislatures. Let them know about that problematic budget amendment that he's proposing, in addition to his other amendments and basically attitude to eviscerate the Virginia Clean Economy Act. So I'll mention a couple of bills with environmental a positive environmental impact did get through, namely the invasive species bill did get through the assembly and was signed by the governor. That takes effect, I think, in 2027. And that bill basically mandates labeling of invasive species for sale. You know, if they're offered for sale at at nurseries within the state, they have to be labeled by 2027 as invasive. According to, I'm not sure exactly uh, what committee is putting together the labeling list, but it won't be difficult to determine a list. Does anyone know? Lil, you're muted.
The Virginia Native Plant Society has been very involved with that.
So they're actually going to compose the list?
They have been composing the list. I'm not sure that that's the one that's being recognized, but they're very active in lobbying in this regard, and they have a list. I don't know if it's the list.
Okay. Well, in any event, the governor did sign it, so that will take effect in 2027. I assume it'll be relatively complete. So that was one positive step. Trying to So in terms of land preservation, the Great Outdoors Act did not get through the assembly for the second straight year, maybe the third straight year, as well as legislation to uh, mandate wildlife crossing or wildlife corridors crossings, as well as funding for that.
Yeah.
There was a budget amendment that the legislature put in to I think it was $450,000 for wildlife crossings, which the governor struck in his budget amendments.
And that's a bipartisan thing. I mean, interesting.
So I'll get to Ivy Main's conclusion, because that gets to your point, Lil. So she says, it will take a new, it might be right that it will take a new administration before Virginia gets serious about meeting its energy challenges, if it does even then. But this session needn't have ended in a partisan stalemate and near zero progress. Most of the bills the governor vetoed or gutted were passed with the help of Republicans, making Youngkin's actions less of a rebuke to the Democrats than members of his own party who were simply trying to do their jobs. So one last thing I want to discuss is some stuff that was presented by both the League of Conservation Voters and VCN in uh, recap events that they held. And that is, we should be worried about what is going to happen at the federal level in terms of funding, because a lot of projects at the state level and projects that nonprofit groups that are environmentally focused are involved with depend upon a certain, are leveraged by federal funding. And so over the summer and in the spring, environmental activists, advocates, and nonprofit officials are going to have to think about how to react to this situation. And so, VCN and LCV are obviously already in discussions about this. I think they might have formed subcommittees of their respective organizations to look at this issue, but it's, we've been discussing the lawlessness of the administration, but the funding cuts are equally, I would, in the environmental sense, are extremely damaging as well. So I put the link to the article, and there's a lot more about specific bills. I just wanted to highlight the ones that our local representatives had tried to get through the assembly this year. One final note: I've been in touch with some organizers from CCAN, and they've asked me to set up a meeting with Senator Deeds in the next week. And if I can land that meeting, I would put out an invitation to all of you on this call and to members of your respective organizations to consider joining me at this meeting, where we can go more in depth on these topics. And a final takeaway from what some of these nonprofit organizations were saying in these recap events. It's their impression and their experience that our state legislatures are getting a bit more superficial with time, and that they actually need a lot of background education on environmental topics. So that makes it more important for these meetings during the summer or spring to occur, because there's more time now to go in depth on these issues. And this is a election season for the House of Delegates, as well as for the governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. And they're going to be slammed in the fall with the election process. So now it's probably a bit unusual in that you want to schedule meetings with some urgency now, or in the next few months, with the legislatures to be able to secure meetings that are more in depth. So again, I'll extend an invitation once I get this meeting set up to people to join me with Senator Deeds, and I'll try to do the same for Delegate Carlson in the coming months. So any questions that people have?
Yeah, Peter.
Yeah, Tom.
Um, I was curious when you said one of the bills passed with a lot of bipartisan support, and I think you mentioned another bill that had environmental bill that had bipartisan support. I'm curious, do you think that there are there's a goodly chunk of Republicans that have significant environmental sensibilities, or do you think they're acting for some other reason out of a kind of, short-term self-interest that's not so obvious?
Well, I think the dynamic is on, I mean, a lot of the bills were bipartisan, but with only 3 to 4 Republicans joining.
Mm-hmm.
But there were a number that, including Colson's bill, I believe, that had very significant Republican support. And there was a bill for to basically study energy efficiency programs for low income individuals, maybe partly to make up for the fact that Virginia's not in RGGI right now. And that's an important part of the RGGI process. And it essentially got no opposition within the General Assembly, but it was vetoed by the governor.
Mm-hmm.
And the dynamic is, even if there was a lot of bipartisan support for bills that the governor vetoes it,
Mm-hmm.
the Republicans are not going to override his veto, even if they voted for it initially.
But it's interesting that there seem to be, at least at times, a significant number of Republicans that are willing to line up for environmental causes.
Yep.
I think there are a number of Republicans that would line up for rural EV charging, for instance, that would line up for distributed solar.
Mm-hmm.
And to some extent, I mean, probably fewer, but for commercial solar. There are, I think, some Republicans that would not vote to gut the Virginia Clean Economy Act. But I think the bottom line is it's going to take a different governor, a different administration before you can see clear passage of environmental priorities.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lil?
Well, so it's not directly climate related, but with that connectivity bill, one of the reasons it was embraced by some Republicans was because they framed it, even though it was really about animal connectivity, they framed it in terms of impact of automobile animal accidents on the roads. So I think if there's some way to put a carrot in, it's a good example of putting a carrot in for the Republicans for something that's actually environmentally or climate sound. And so, I mean, that was just, maybe it was just lucky, but I don't know if that's a strategy to be played with. What's the carrot that we can give them?
Yeah, I mean, these projects, basically, I mean, the number of these projects have been shown to reduce collisions by over 90%. So
there was a study that was cited in the Albemarle County Biodiversity Action Plan. There was a lady from VDOT who did some analyses of bear and deer and other wildlife killed on I-64. And then there were some experimental undercrossings built, which had big effects. But one of her arguments was exactly what Lil brought up. I was astonished, but it was really expensive, all the damage to automobiles, collisions caused, and all the cost of picking up carcasses, bear carcasses. I mean, a lot of bears, which is sad, get killed on I-64 every year.
Insurance companies like it too. So she actually, it was really fascinating. She's a biologist in the Department of Transportation, and she put up those fences. If you're going on 64 west of Charlottesville, you see those fences. She got money from the Department of Transportation, put up those fences, and the underpasses were just the culverts that were already there. So the fences would just sort of funnel the wildlife into those. And it was just remarkable, the difference obviously in impacts. So that's a cheap, wonderful thing to do. And there's been all this study that shows where the points of connectivity, where it'd be the most cost effective, and on and on. It's a good program, and it's gotten passed. It just never has gotten the funding. And now it's, now that's not going to happen anytime soon.
I would like to pose a question to the people on this call. I mean, what do you What is your vision for dealing with the data center issue? Anyone wanna?
My vision for dealing with all of this is to work very actively in the 2025 election and make sure that we have a Democratic administration and also as many increased seats held by Democrats in the House of Delegates. One of the reasons why some Republicans would line up in favor of a bill that is reasonable and rational is because with the Supreme Court redistricting, some of them are in really tight districts.
Yep.
And if pressure is really applied, beating down what Youngkin has done and how it's jeopardizing the future and linking everything that the Republican brand stands for now federally to any Republican trying to run locally, I think can lead to some serious losses for the Republican Party. Other than that, I don't have any other plans. I mean, that's this year, that's in the next few months, and that's the only thing that'll make a difference in Virginia. In terms of what the federal government is doing, the only plan I can see is impeach Trump.
Max?
Yeah. Different tag on it a little bit, but I think it's kind of obvious that there will be a lot of data centers globally, maybe not necessarily in our neighborhood, so we might be able to avoid that, but I mean, there will be a lot more data centers and they will use energy. I think there's three things to that. I mean, one is ideally it's renewable energy. Ideally, it's additional renewable energy. And the second thing is energy efficiency in the data centers. And that's something we can also work with data centers on. Even if the governor doesn't want to move on this, we can talk to the companies who are building them. I think there's by Lake Anna, there's data centers there being built, and the other part is of course thinking bigger, because of course they use energy, but they're kind of great in the sense that they make heat, right? So I mean, for them, they want to get rid of the heat, but you can actually reuse that if you can capture the heat either for storage or for hot water generation. There are cases where people use it for municipal pools. You can heat the pool for free. There's a lot of applications that are possible that don't come to the mind of the companies. And I think we should try to think in that way. In Europe, they have legal obligations from next year on that data centers use some of the excess heat and use renewable energy and also meet certain energy efficiency thresholds. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there where we can think about. And I think that's something we can do even if the state is maybe not able to pass anything on this. Even if, I mean, it's of course not bad if they do. I mean, that's even better. But it's something where you can also just go and seek dialogue and try to, because it's a win-win for the companies too. They have to spend a lot of money on cooling, and in reality, if they don't need to spend money on cooling but can basically get rid of the heat for free, then that can be an interesting combination. Just think of, we could have great year-round heated pools in Charlottesville from data centers, or also in Albemarle, of course. I'm not saying this just for the city. Sorry, I'm going on too long.
I don't have a plan or a vision for the data centers, although Max, I mean, what you pushed
those main best practices, concepts, would be great to apply here in the US, with appropriate pressure. I'm kind of surprised that the governor doesn't care about rising electrical costs for the consumers.
He's going
I
to
mean,
blame it on the Clean Economy Act.
yeah, but is that,
I mean, it's a retrograde position, but
yeah.
that's their plan. That's it.
Well, I guess we needed some talking points against that then. So,
Well, there are plenty. I
uh-huh.
was intrigued by what Max said about what Europe is doing in terms of regulation
Yeah,
and basically
right.
mandates for renewable energy supply for the data centers. I mean, that is something that the General Assembly could come back to. I mean, Senator Deeds' bill partially went in that direction, and it made it fairly farther than I think what VCN thought, but ultimately it didn't get out of committee. But I think, yeah, I mean, there is going to be data center development, obviously. And a complicating factor is that Virginia is proximate to the Pentagon, and there were actually two bills proposed by Democratic legislators in the General Assembly this year that were pulled by their patrons because they got a call from the Pentagon. There were bills that were dealing with basically transparency around what energy is being pulled by the data centers. And the Pentagon asked them to strike those bills. And my assumption is that the Pentagon is concerned that if you basically track, at a granular level, what is being the energy usage by the data centers, adversaries will be able to determine, the Pentagon is using this for modeling, using AI, something like that. So, I raised the fact that, because of the proximity of the Pentagon, because of what's already present in Virginia, there's going to be data center development. But like in Europe, you have to have regulations or you're going to blow your climate goals out of the water.
I could just comment. I mean, it seems to me this all comes back to this kind of basic fact about if you want to live sustainably, you have to live within limits. And it seems to me that at some point, part of sort of policy goals for governments will have to be so much per capita consumption of energy per year, and not simply the idea that if ever we have a nifty device that's really everybody likes to use, we just have to find enough energy to meet that demand, which I think is the kind of framework we're in right now.
Drill, baby, drill.
You can also make the argument that does Virginia have to actually have 70% of the, a single state? Why do we actually have to have a monopoly on it when it's, destroying our energy goals essentially?
Some of us have been speculating about all the data centers and intelligence centers kind of cementing our being targeted by nuclear weapons in foreign countries. Some of us who grew up in the 50s in cities that were targeted by Russians who spent a lot of time diving under desks. And when I was in grammar school, the boys wore dog tags to identify you in case your incinerated body was found after a nuclear attack. I mean, so Marcia remembers that too, and I remember it. And so if you go through years of diving under your desk to protect yourself between seeing the detonation flash and the arrival of the blast wave, which as 7-year-olds we were all taught you had a moment to do that.
All taught, okay.
Well, in New Orleans we were. Ren says in Schuyler they weren't taught that. They didn't dive under their desks or get dog tags to wear. But anyway, in New Orleans you did.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to be grim, but I will point out that Ravenna Futures is basically tied organizationally and probably electronically, definitely, to Fort Belvoir, in DC in terms of military intelligence. So
This is actually my grammar school dog tag, or it really is, as a 10-year-old in 1954 in New Orleans.
So if they're going to take out Port Belvoir, they might as well take out Ravenna Futures too, with a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Just on that bright note.
Mm.
I forgot to mention that another thing that Governor Youngkin is proposing is that he wants to make nuclear energy retroactively part of the renewable energy portfolio in Virginia, which would basically would satisfy the requirements of the renewable energy portfolio for a number of years and disincentivize development of solar and wind projects. And while we're on the subject of wind, he vetoed a bill to he vetoed bills that would strengthen the offshore wind development process in Virginia. And the reason he gave is that he said that there's declining interest in offshore wind at a federal level, obviously tying it into the Trump administration. And this is, obviously a project the Dominion has started. So
This is all too depressing. Can we talk about something else?
I will, yes, Marcia, let's go into the member updates.